Cortney has barely finished talking about wedding dates when she looks at Phil and drops the one sentence that changes everything between them. Because instead of arguing about venues, guest lists, flowers, or where everybody is going to sit, she quietly tells him that she thinks she might be pregnant. Phil does not smile right away. He does not reach for her. And he does not give Cortney the excited reaction she clearly expected, because for several uncomfortable seconds, he just stares at her like his brain is trying to catch up with what she has said. Cortney notices every second of that silence, and you can almost watch her mood change, because she went into this conversation nervous but hopeful, while Phil's expression suddenly makes the possible pregnancy feel less like exciting news and more like a problem that has landed in the middle of their wedding plans. Phil finally asks Cortney how sure she is, and that is probably a reasonable question, but it is definitely not the question Cortney wanted to hear first. She explains that she is late, she has been feeling different, and she has been paying close attention to her body because something does not feel normal. Phil asks whether she has taken a pregnancy test yet, and Cortney says she has not because she wanted to tell him before doing anything else. That detail matters because Cortney clearly imagined this moment as something intimate between them, maybe even something that would bring them closer. But instead, Phil immediately starts trying to understand the situation logically. Cortney wants emotion first and questions later, while Phil wants answers before he lets himself react. And that difference creates tension almost instantly. Then Phil asks the question that really throws Cortney off, because he says, "What are we going to do if you are pregnant?" Cortney immediately looks at him differently, because she does not hear concern in that question, she hears doubt. She asks him what exactly he means by "what are we going to do?" because from her perspective, they already know what they are doing. They are planning a wedding, they have talked about building a life together, they have talked about children, and if a baby is suddenly part of that future, then they deal with it together. Phil tries to explain that he is not saying he wants to leave or that he would refuse responsibility, but Cortney is already hurt because his first instinct seems to be worrying about how much this changes their lives instead of being excited that they may be starting a family. This is where the real issue starts appearing, because Cortney and Phil are not actually arguing about pregnancy yet. They are arguing about what each person believes commitment should look like when plans suddenly change. Phil says he thought they would get married first, spend some time adjusting to married life, work out where they would live permanently, build more savings, and then start trying for children when everything felt more stable. Cortney reminds him that he has already told her he wants children with her, and Phil says wanting children someday is not the same thing as potentially becoming a father right now. The sentence makes sense, but it lands badly because Cortney immediately starts wondering whether Phil loved talking about their future only because the future always seemed comfortably far away. Cortney tells him that she does not understand why he suddenly sounds frightened by things they have already discussed. And Phil says discussing a baby over dinner is very different from realizing there might actually be one coming. He says there are practical questions they cannot ignore, including housing, insurance, medical costs, childcare, work schedules, and whether either one of them would need to change jobs or reduce hours after the baby arrives. Cortney looks frustrated because she is trying to process an emotional possibility, while Phil sounds like he is already opened a calculator inside his head. Every question he asks is reasonable by itself, but together they make Cortney feel like Phil is building a case for why the pregnancy would be terrible timing. And once she starts feeling that way, almost everything he says sounds colder than he probably intends. Cortney tries to change the energy by telling Phil that maybe they should allow themselves to be excited, because everything they wanted might simply be happening sooner than expected. Phil says he is not saying they cannot be excited, but he does not want excitement to stop them from thinking realistically. That answer bothers Cortney because she asks why being happy and being responsible suddenly have to be opposites. Phil says they do not, but he also does not want them spending thousands on a wedding while pretending a possible baby would not completely change their finances. Now we have reached the exact point where this pregnancy scare starts affecting the wedding, and Cortney's face tells you she did not expect Phil to connect those two things quite this quickly. Cortney asks him whether he would still marry her if she is pregnant, and Phil pauses for just a little too long. It is not some massive dramatic silence where the room goes completely dead for several minutes, but it is long enough that Cortney catches it immediately. Phil eventually says yes. Of course he still wants to marry her, But by then, Cortney is already asking why he had to think about the answer. Phil says he was not thinking about whether he wants the marriage. He was thinking about how their entire timeline would change. But Cortney does not hear much after the pause, because that hesitation is now stuck in her mind. For Phil, those few seconds mean he was processing. For Cortney, those few seconds mean part of him was considering another answer. That small moment becomes much bigger than the actual words, because Cortney tells Phil she refuses to feel like she has somehow ruined their wedding plans by possibly becoming pregnant. Phil immediately says nobody used the word ruin, but now the word is sitting right in the middle of the conversation anyway. Cortney says that is what his reaction feels like, because everything was exciting until she mentioned a baby, and then suddenly Phil started talking about expenses, timelines, sacrifices, and changing plans. Phil gets frustrated because he feels like Cortney is judging him for thinking responsibly, while Cortney feels like Phil is hiding behind responsibility because he cannot admit how scared he really is. Neither one is completely wrong, which makes the argument much harder than if one person were obviously behaving badly. The next morning, they are supposed to continue wedding planning, but the excitement is almost completely gone. Phil starts talking about possible dates and says he still wants to look at the venue options they discuss, almost like returning to the original plan will prove that he is still committed. Cortney watches him carefully and asks whether he genuinely wants to continue planning, or whether he is only doing it because he knows she is upset. Phil looks confused because from his perspective, he is doing exactly what Cortney said she needed. But she explains that pretending the previous conversation never happened does not make her feel better. Phil thinks moving forward should reassure her, while Cortney thinks moving forward without discussing his fear means he is avoiding the real problem. Then money becomes the center of the conversation, and this is where things get noticeably more uncomfortable. Phil suggests that they should reduce the wedding budget until they know whether Cortney is actually pregnant, and he starts mentioning areas where they could save money, including a smaller guest list, a simpler reception, fewer expensive details, and possibly changing the venue. Cortney immediately becomes defensive because she feels like Phil has gone from wanting the wedding they planned to slowly taking pieces away from it. Phil says he is not taking away the marriage. He is talking about cutting unnecessary spending. But Cortney says the timing makes it feel like he suddenly sees their wedding as irresponsible. This is probably where viewers would start choosing sides, because Phil is not wrong to think about money, especially if they may be preparing for a baby. But Cortney is also not wrong to notice that all these concerns seem to be appearing at the exact moment she tells him she could be pregnant. She asks whether Phil had concerns about the wedding budget before this, and after hesitating again, he admits that he did. That answer makes everything worse, because Cortney wants to know why he never said anything earlier. Phil explains that he did not want every romantic conversation about the wedding to become a debate about costs, but Cortney fires back that apparently he saved every concern for the moment she was already feeling emotionally vulnerable. Phil gets quiet again, and Cortney immediately reacts, because by now his silence is becoming its own character in this relationship. She tells him that every time the conversation becomes uncomfortable, he disappears into his thoughts and leaves her guessing what he actually feels. Phil says he is trying not to say something hurtful while frustrated, but Cortney tells him that silence can be hurtful too, when she has no idea whether he is thinking about money, marriage, or leaving. Phil insists that leaving has never been part of the conversation, but Cortney says she does not want to have to drag reassurance out of the person she is supposed to marry. That is probably the clearest explanation of why his initial reaction bothered her so much. Later, Cortney decides she needs to talk to somebody else because she feels like every conversation with Phil turns into another practical debate. She calls a close family member and says she may be pregnant, but she has not confirmed it yet. The family member is shocked and immediately asks how Phil reacted, and Cortney admits that his reaction was not what she hoped for. She explains the silence, the questions about money, and his suggestion that they may need to change the wedding. Cortney clearly wants emotional support, but instead, the family member starts asking whether Phil is financially prepared, whether they have enough space for a baby, whether Cortney could manage if the relationship became difficult, and whether moving forward with the wedding right now is still smart. Cortney becomes irritated because now she feels like everybody is treating the possible pregnancy as a disaster. She reminds the family member that the wedding was already happening before any pregnancy scare, and she says she does not want people acting like she suddenly needs to marry Phil because she might be having his baby. That point is important to Cortney because the last thing she wants is for family members to look at the wedding and assume it became some emergency decision. She wants the marriage to stand on its own, separate from the pregnancy, because otherwise she worries the baby will always be treated like the reason they rushed into everything. Unfortunately for Cortney, the news does not stay completely private, and soon another family member knows enough to start asking questions. Phil discovers that the possible pregnancy has already become a family conversation before he and Cortney even know whether it is real, and he is immediately frustrated. He tells Cortney that they should have been allowed to process this together before everybody started discussing their relationship. Cortney says she told one person because she felt emotionally alone after his reaction, and that phrase clearly hurts Phil, because he says he has been sitting there trying to figure out how to support their future, and somehow she has turned that into him abandoning her emotionally. Cortney says planning is not the same thing as reassurance, while Phil says reassurance without a plan means very little when they may be responsible for another human being. That is the same argument again, but now it feels more personal because family members are involved. Cortney tells him she needed somebody who could hear that she was scared and excited without immediately turning everything into a list of problems. Phil says he wishes she had told him that directly instead of telling somebody else first. Cortney reminds him that she tried, but every time she expressed excitement, he responded with another financial question. Phil says he cannot apologize for taking a possible pregnancy seriously, and Cortney tells him she never asked him not to take it seriously. She asked him not to make her feel like she had delivered terrible news. The ridiculous part is that they still do not even know whether Cortney is pregnant, and both of them eventually realize they are fighting over a future that might not exist. Phil says they need an actual answer before they keep rearranging their entire lives, and Cortney agrees to take a pregnancy test. Suddenly, the mood changes again because taking the test makes everything real in a way talking never did. Cortney admits that she is scared of both possible results. If it is positive, their lives change immediately. If it is negative, she knows part of her might feel disappointed because she has already started imagining the baby. That admission surprises Phil, because until now he assumed Cortney was mostly anxious. She explains that when she first realized she could be pregnant, she immediately pictured the three of them together, and although that image frightened her, it also made her happy. Phil listens quietly and finally tells her that he has imagined it too. Cortney asks why he never said that, and Phil admits that his mind goes to what could go wrong first, because he thinks preparing for problems is how he protects people he loves. Cortney tells him that sometimes protection without warmth just feels like fear, and Phil actually seems to understand what she means this time instead of defending himself. They take the test, but of course the moment that should provide clarity creates even more uncertainty, because the result is difficult to trust. Cortney thinks she can see something. Phil is not convinced, and after checking the timing, they realize the test may simply have been taken too early. Cortney becomes frustrated because now they are back in the same place, except they have already argued about nearly every major decision in their future. Phil suggests waiting and testing again or getting proper confirmation, while Cortney sits there staring at the test like she can somehow force it to give them a clearer answer. Phil notices that Cortney looks disappointed, and he asks whether she was hoping for a positive result. Cortney says she does not know if hoping is the right word, because she understands how complicated everything would become, but she admits that seeing an unclear result makes her realize how much she had already emotionally connected to the possibility. Phil says he understands, and then he surprises her by admitting that he feels something similar. He says part of him is relieved they have more time to think, but another part had already imagined holding their child. Cortney looks at him differently, because this is the first time Phil has spoken about the possible baby as something emotional, rather than something requiring a financial plan. For a brief moment, it feels like they are finally getting somewhere. And then the wedding venue calls. The date they had been considering is available, but they have to make a decision quickly if they want to secure it. Suddenly, the wedding is no longer another conversation they can postpone, because money has to be paid, paperwork has to be completed, and the date has to become official. Cortney sees the opportunity as a test of whether Phil is truly committed to moving forward, so she wants to secure the date immediately. Phil says he still wants the date, but he thinks they should agree on a revised budget first. Cortney asks whether he seriously wants to risk losing the date, because they have not decided exactly how many people should attend. And Phil asks whether she seriously wants to hand over money when they have no idea what their financial situation could look like in a few months. There it is again, the same disagreement, wearing a different outfit. Cortney thinks choosing the date proves the relationship is secure. Phil thinks choosing the budget first proves the relationship is mature. mature. Neither one sees their own position as emotional, but both positions are deeply emotional because Cortney fears being abandoned and Phil fears losing control of a situation that is changing faster than he can process it. The family pressure becomes even stronger when one of Cortney's relatives decides to speak directly with Phil. The conversation starts politely, but it quickly becomes an interrogation about what Phil actually plans to do if Cortney is pregnant. The relative asks about savings, work, housing, childcare, and whether Phil has thought about what happens if Cortney needs more financial support during pregnancy. Phil immediately becomes defensive because he feels like he is being interviewed for permission to continue his own relationship. But the family member tells him that loving Cortney is easy to say, while there is no baby crying at 3 in the morning and no unexpected bill sitting on the table. That comment gets Phil's attention because suddenly he stops trying to defend himself and starts answering honestly. He admits he does not have every detail figured out and says anybody claiming they are completely prepared for something this big is probably lying to themselves. He cannot promise perfect finances, a perfect home, or a perfectly calm first year of marriage. But he says if Cortney is pregnant, he will not make her carry the responsibility alone. He says he would change his work schedule if necessary, cut personal spending, move if they found somewhere more affordable, and reduce the wedding budget, because taking care of their child would obviously matter more than impressing guests for one day. Cortney overhears enough of this conversation to stop in the hallway and listen, and this becomes one of the most important moments because Phil is not saying these things directly to make her feel better. He does not even know she can hear him. The family member asks him directly whether the pregnancy changes his desire to marry Cortney, and Phil says no, because Cortney is not what scares him. The timing scares him. The amount of responsibility arriving at once scares him. The possibility of making a bad financial decision scares him. Becoming a father before he feels prepared scares him. But none of that means he wants a life without Cortney. That is the sentence Cortney wanted from the beginning. She needed to hear that Phil's fear belonged to the circumstances and not to his feelings for her. When they speak afterward, Cortney is noticeably calmer, and she tells Phil she heard part of the conversation. Phil looks embarrassed because he probably wishes he had found those words earlier, but Cortney says hearing him explain it to somebody else actually helped, because she knew he was not simply giving her the answer she wanted. Phil admits that he is not always good at separating fear from rejection when he speaks, and Cortney admits that she is not always good at hearing concern without assuming the worst. Just when it seems like they finally understand each other, Phil brings up another major issue and says they may need to reconsider their living situation if the pregnancy is confirmed. Cortney immediately assumes this means another delay, but Phil explains that he is thinking about space, cost, safety, and whether their current place makes sense with a baby. Cortney becomes defensive because she worries that more practical could mean moving farther away from her family. She tells Phil that if she is pregnant, she wants to remain close to people who can help, especially during the first months after the baby arrives. Phil says he is not trying to isolate her and actually agrees that family support could be valuable, but he wants them to look at numbers instead of automatically choosing the most comfortable emotional option. Cortney tells him that support is not just an emotional luxury when you have a newborn, and Phil realizes she has a point. They start talking more calmly about neighborhoods, commuting, rent, and how often they would realistically see family if they moved farther away. For the first time, the practical conversation does not immediately become an emotional argument because both of them are explaining what they need, instead of assuming the other person has bad intentions. That calmer conversation opens the door to the real problem underneath everything. Cortney admits she has been afraid for a long time that Phil likes talking about their future more than actually moving toward it. She tells him that every major step seems to produce another reason to wait, another concern to solve, or another condition that needs to be perfect first. She says she knows life requires planning, but after a while, constant preparation can start feeling exactly like avoidance. Cortney wants to know that when life becomes messy, Phil is still capable of choosing her without needing every possible outcome controlled first. Phil tells her his fear is almost the opposite because he thinks Cortney sometimes uses forward movement as proof that a relationship is secure. If they are booking a venue, making plans, talking about children, or changing their lives quickly, then she feels loved. But the second Phil asks to slow something down, she starts questioning whether he still wants the relationship. He says he does not want to spend their marriage agreeing to things simply because saying no or asking for time might make Cortney feel rejected. Phil wants them to build a future because it makes sense for both of them, not because they are scared that slowing down means losing each other. That is the hidden conflict the pregnancy scare exposes. Cortney finds security in momentum. Phil finds security in preparation. Cortney believes movement proves commitment, while Phil believes planning proves commitment. She sees hesitation and worries he is emotionally pulling away. He sees urgency and worries they are allowing fear to make decisions for them. The possible baby did not create this difference. It simply forced them to confront it much sooner than they expected. And that is why almost every conversation has felt so explosive, despite both people claiming they want the same future. They eventually agree on a compromise that sounds more realistic than anything they have discussed before. The wedding will continue, but the budget will be reduced. They will cut the guest list instead of changing the entire date. They will keep more savings available until they understand what the pregnancy means financially. They will not make a final decision about moving until they have proper confirmation. Most importantly, they agree that future decisions will be discussed between them before they become family debates, because both of them have already seen how quickly outside opinions can make a difficult situation even harder. Cortney is relieved because the wedding is still moving forward, while Phil looks relieved because they finally have a plan that does not depend on spending money they may soon need elsewhere. Cortney even jokes that maybe the smaller guest list will save them from inviting people they did not really want there anyway, and Phil says that might be the first good thing to come out of the entire argument. It is a small moment, but it matters, because for the first time they are laughing about the pressure instead of turning it against each other. Then, the pregnancy question returns in the biggest way possible, because Cortney gets confirmation that the first test was too early to trust and schedules a proper follow-up. This time, the waiting feels completely different. The first time she thought she might be pregnant, she was mostly wondering how Phil would react. Now both of them have already discussed money, family, housing, marriage, fear, expectations, and what becoming parents would actually require. Cortney says it feels like they have lived 6 months of relationship problems in less than 1 week. And Phil jokes that maybe they should start charging relatives every time somebody gives them unsolicited advice. Before they receive the final answer, Cortney asks Phil one question that she says matters more than anything else. If the result is positive, what is the first thing he wants to do? Phil thinks about it for a moment, but this time the pause does not frighten Cortney because she knows what he is doing. Phil says the first thing he wants to do is make sure Cortney knows they are a team, and after that they can panic together about everything else. Cortney actually laughs because it is the most honest and emotionally direct answer he has given since this situation started. She tells him that was all she wanted from the beginning. She never expected Phil to promise that pregnancy would be easy, that money would never become stressful, or that their wedding would happen exactly the way they originally imagined. She simply wanted to know that his fear was something they would carry together, instead of something he would use to distance himself from her. Phil admits he understands that now, and says his first reaction probably made everything worse, because he immediately jumped into problem solving before remembering that Cortney needed him emotionally. Then, the confirmation finally arrives. Cortney decides she wants to tell Phil privately before anybody else hears a single word, which is probably wise considering how quickly the first rumor moved through the family. She meets him with an expression that immediately tells him something has changed. Phil asks whether she knows, and Cortney says yes. She finally has a clear answer. He looks at her face like he is trying to figure out what she is about to say before she actually says it. And for a few seconds, the entire argument about money, wedding plans, family, and timing disappears. Cortney tells Phil she is pregnant. Phil freezes again, but this time the silence feels completely different, because almost immediately he reaches for her hand and starts smiling through the shock. He tells her they are really doing this. And Cortney begins crying because now every hypothetical conversation they have been having is suddenly real. There is actually a baby coming, and the wedding is no longer the only major event on their calendar. Phil hugs her and admits that he is terrified, but he tells Cortney he is not going anywhere. Cortney says she is terrified too. And that one admission seems to release some of the pressure, because neither one needs to pretend they are completely prepared anymore. For the first time, they are afraid together, instead of being afraid of each other. Cortney does not need Phil to act like becoming a father overnight is easy, and Phil does not need Cortney to act like excitement somehow removes every financial problem. They can finally admit that the timing is crazy without treating the pregnancy like bad news. Phil says he cannot believe they are going to have a baby, and Cortney tells him she cannot believe they are going to have a baby and plan a wedding at the same time. They both laugh, but you can tell the reality of that sentence is already beginning to sink in. Then Cortney asks the question everybody knew was coming, because pregnancy may be confirmed, but the wedding is still sitting right there, waiting for a decision. She asks Phil what this means for the wedding. Phil says he still wants to marry her, and Cortney immediately looks relieved. But then he adds that he thinks they need to rethink how they are doing it. That phrase instantly brings back all of Cortney's earlier fears, because she asks whether he means changing the date. Phil says no, not necessarily, but he wants them to simplify everything around the wedding. Phil explains that he would rather reduce the guest list, choose a less expensive reception, and keep more money available for the baby than spend heavily simply because they are worried about disappointing other people. Cortney listens, but you can see that part of her is disappointed because she had already pictured what the wedding would look like. Phil tells her he understands that and does not expect her to suddenly stop caring, but he says the meaning of the wedding should matter more than whether every detail stays exactly the same. Cortney asks him whether this is truly about protecting their finances or whether the pregnancy has made him want to escape some of the pressure around marriage. Phil tells her the baby has made him want to remove the wrong pressure, not remove the commitment. He says he would rather marry Cortney in front of 20 people and know they can handle an unexpected expense than impress a room full of guests and begin married life worrying about every bill. For once, Cortney does not immediately argue, because this version of Phil's financial concern sounds different. He is no longer talking about what they cannot do. He is explaining what he wants to protect. Still, Cortney tells him there is one thing she will not accept. She does not want their child to grow up hearing that mom and dad rushed their wedding because she got pregnant. She does not want family members whispering that Phil only married her because he felt responsible. Phil immediately says that is not what is happening, but Cortney asks the difficult question anyway. If she were not pregnant, would he still be pushing forward with the same wedding date? This time, Phil does not panic over the question. He tells Cortney that he was already planning to marry her before the pregnancy, and he would still be planning to marry her without it. What has changed is not whether he wants the marriage, but how much he cares about proving anything to everybody watching them. Phil says the pregnancy has made him realize they are about to become a family, whether the reception has 20 guests or 200. And he does not want their first major decision as parents to be based on keeping other people happy. That answer lands better, because Cortney has finally started understanding the difference between Phil questioning the relationship and Phil questioning the plan. She admits that she has probably treated those things like they are the same, because when plans change, she automatically worries that feelings have changed too. Phil admits he has probably made that fear worse by waiting too long to explain what he actually feels. Neither one suddenly becomes perfect, but for the first time they seem aware of the pattern before it turns into another argument. Then, the family messages start arriving. One relative wants to know whether the pregnancy is confirmed. Another wants to know whether they are changing the wedding date. Somebody else asks whether they have decided where they will live. Phil looks at Cortney's phone and says they should not answer anybody yet. Cortney asks why, and Phil tells her because he wants their next decision to belong to them for at least one night before it becomes everybody else's discussion. Cortney agrees, but reminds him they cannot keep the pregnancy private forever, especially if she starts showing before the wedding. Phil says he is not asking her to hide anything. He simply wants them to know what they are announcing before everybody starts telling them what they should do. Cortney puts her phone down, and for once, neither of them immediately starts solving another problem. They sit there together knowing the baby is real, the wedding is real, and almost every part of their future now needs to be reconsidered. Phil eventually asks whether Cortney still wants the original wedding date. Cortney says yes, but maybe she no longer wants the original wedding. Phil looks surprised and asks what changed. Cortney says she does not want to spend the next few months fighting over details while pregnant, just because she is trying to recreate a picture she had before their reality changed. She says she could accept something smaller, as long as it feels like they chose a different wedding rather than lost the wedding they wanted. Phil tells tells her that is exactly what he has been trying to explain, and Cortney immediately warns him not to ruin the moment by saying, "I told you so." Phil laughs and says he values his life too much for that. It is another light moment, but then Cortney remembers the obvious problem with shrinking the wedding. They have to decide who gets removed from the guest list. She says some family members are going to take it very personally, and Phil looks like he would rather take another pregnancy test than manage that conversation. The first family discussion goes about as badly as expected, because one relative immediately asks whether Phil is the person pushing for a smaller wedding. Cortney says it was a joint decision, but nobody fully believes her, because they already know Phil was worried about finances. Another relative says Cortney should not have to sacrifice the wedding she wanted, because Phil was unprepared for a baby. Phil tries to stay calm, but you can tell he is getting frustrated, because the family keeps talking like the pregnancy is something Cortney created alone, and he is reacting to afterward. Phil finally explains that neither of them planned for this exact timing, and cutting the budget is not punishment. He says their priorities changed because they are about to become parents, which is what responsible adults are supposed to do when circumstances change. Cortney supports him, but then one family member asks whether reducing the wedding is the first step toward postponing it entirely. The question brings the tension right back because Cortney looks at Phil, waiting to see whether he will hesitate again. Phil says no. He wants the wedding to happen. He simply wants a wedding they can afford, without pretending their finances will remain exactly the same after the baby arrives. That firm answer surprises the family, and probably surprises Cortney too, because this time he does not leave any room for interpretation. The wedding is happening, the baby is coming, and Phil is done allowing every practical concern to be translated into doubt about whether he wants Cortney. Later, Cortney admits that seeing Phil defend the wedding to her family means more to her than she expected. She says part of her was still waiting for him to use the pressure as a reason to slow everything down. Phil says he thought about whether slowing down would be easier, but easier is not necessarily what he wants. He wants Cortney, he wants their child, and he wants the marriage, but he also wants them to stop acting like being committed means agreeing with each other about every decision. That might be the biggest shift in their relationship, because Cortney finally understands that Phil's questions are not automatically rejection, while Phil finally understands that emotional reassurance is not some unnecessary extra he can skip, because he already has a plan. They have not solved the finances, the housing question remains open, the guest list is still going to upset people. And neither one knows what becoming parents will actually look like, but at least they are finally fighting the problems instead of constantly fighting each other. The pregnancy has forced every weakness in their relationship into the open before the wedding, which could either be the worst possible timing or strangely useful timing. Cortney now knows exactly what Phil looks like when he feels overwhelmed. Phil now knows exactly what happens when Cortney feels uncertain about his commitment. Both of them have seen how quickly family members can turn one private concern into a much bigger conflict. They have also learned that planning a future together sounds romantic until the future suddenly arrives faster than expected and starts demanding real decisions. The biggest challenge now is no longer whether Cortney is pregnant, because that question has finally been answered. It is whether these two can make marriage decisions while becoming parents without allowing fear, money, family pressure, or other people's opinions to control them. Cortney wants the wedding to prove that their relationship has not been weakened by the pregnancy, while Phil wants the decisions around the wedding to prove that they are capable of becoming a responsible family. Those goals are not actually incompatible, but if they stop communicating again, the difference could create another massive fight. For now, Cortney is pregnant, Phil still wants the marriage, and the wedding appears to be moving forward. But almost nothing about it will look exactly the way they first imagined. The guest list may shrink, the budget is changing, housing decisions are becoming urgent, and family members already have plenty to say about every choice they make. What started as one nervous pregnancy confession has turned into a complete test of whether Cortney and Phil are ready for the future they kept saying they wanted. Because talking about marriage and children is easy when both things are somewhere in the distance, but dealing with both at almost the same time is an entirely different reality. And judging by how quickly the first few days spiraled from wedding excitement into arguments about money, family, commitment, housing, and parenthood, the pregnancy reveal may not even be the biggest surprise waiting for them. Phil has finally convinced Cortney that he is not planning an escape, Cortney has finally convinced Phil that reassurance matters as much as preparation. But now they have to prove those lessons last when the real pressure begins. A positive pregnancy test can bring them together in one emotional moment, but the months that follow will show whether they can actually build the stable marriage both of them keep promising they want. This script is fictional.